Happy Thursday morning, everybody. I am Matt Scalisi, and I'm joined by Ben Flanagan, my co-host here on Bammers. We do this every Thursday morning. It's the show about Alabama fan culture. It's about football, but it's about football from the fans' perspective and what you guys see out there in the stands and watching at home on Saturdays and all throughout the off season. And we build this show around what you guys, our viewers, think and your opinions. And really this show exists to let you guys weigh in on the discussion. Ben and I are here, and we're kind of the icebreakers. We're going to get the discussion started on whatever we're talking about, but we want you guys to comment, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, and we're going to put your comments up on the screen with us live. We'll read some of them. We'll react to them. So weigh in on our debate today, and our debate today is about villains. That's how I'm choosing to say it. We've done rivalries before. We've talked about that a little bit on this program, but today, Ben, I wanted us to focus on the individual characters that make Bama fans pissed off. And we're focusing on the Saban era, but I can remember certainly growing up with there being a few names in the mouths of all my Bama fan family members that they couldn't say it without spitting a little bit.
Yeah, look, I mean, at some point we're going to have to delve much deeper into the greater Alabama history and the catalogs, because I know that some people are just like, there's more than just the Saban era. But
it's a pretty rich era to draw from.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a future episode, but there's an argument that this is now the golden era of Alabama football. I don't know if that's going to upset anybody who is all about the Bill Curry years, but I mean, look. This is like you said, this is a rich time. There's already a lot of history to move through. I mean, it's the bulk of Alabama's NFL history in terms of draft picks that have been created that we've discussed in recent memory. But yeah, in terms of like the villains, Matt, we're going to talk about like individual people, but also sort of like ideas, right? And things in these narratives that have been created throughout the years that have had an impact on, I think, the perception that people have of Alabama football. And I think that perception is really important to a lot of fans, how everybody else feels about Alabama, because most fans may not care what outsiders think of Alabama, but they've got an opinion on what people think about Alabama. And a lot of this stuff has to do with how that image and identity has been impacted from outsiders.
Very, very interesting framing of that, Ben. I do agree, and I've told this to people before because I cover Alabama and Auburn, and I have to treat the fan bases very differently. I have to write for the two audiences very differently, and and one of the things that I would say is a difference when people ask me about that from outside of our state is I mean there's a lot of differences, but I think one of them is Alabama fans pay more attention to what the rest of the country thinks about Alabama.
Yes.
And, I don't necessarily, I'm not saying that as a negative of like, you care about what everybody else thinks. I think that's to some degree, that's where the pride comes from. That's Alabama football, I think, has always been a source of pride for fans in this state. And it's a way to look around to the rest of the country and say, this is a thing that we have that everybody around the whole country has to respect us as the best at it. And I think that's a sort of unique thing about Alabama that I think Auburn fans are a little bit more, we don't care what any of y'all think, but we're our own thing, and that's all we care about. And Alabama fans, I think, want to be part of the bigger picture and the national discussion.
Yeah, this show is sort of based on the podcast Bammers, and there's an episode that I did, and it's why do the media hate Alabama? Because again, there's this perception, maybe the media is one of the biggest villains of the Saban era, right? Where no matter how good Alabama is, a lot of fans get the idea that ESPN or local media or whoever, they can't stand Alabama's success, right? And so they might slant their coverage in a certain way or their tone to make it sound like they've got it in for Alabama. The commentators who are calling the game, so like Vern and Gary could be part of this list, I think, for a lot of Alabama fans. But yeah, it's crazy. So people go listen to that. I talked to folks like Dan Wolken, who I think Alabama fans know.
They have opinions on Dan Wolken.
Yeah. Who talks about why he hates Alabama. Tim Brando talks about why he hates Alabama. So go check it out. But we can dive right in, Matt, if you want to.
We will. I just want to highlight a couple of comments that have come in so far. Charles Taylor says Alabama is Dragon Ball Z, X-Men, Ninja Turtles, Superman, and Popeye all in one. Roll Tide.
Wow.
Crossover. Big crossover there.
It's the Popeye for me, Matt.
That's right. Len Gillespie says any negative comments / sports articles are simply stated out of jealousy. We do not give a rat's ass what the haters say. As long as we rule the mountain, we don't care. I do think there's some degree of that, Len. I do agree that when you win all the games, it doesn't matter what anybody else says. And I think that's a big part of where the attitude comes from there. But, look, I think Alabama fans, we're younger than some of our readers, but I'm still old enough to remember 2005 when a Sports Illustrated cover that said Bama's back was a big deal because it meant people were talking about Alabama again on the national scene.
But even when you're great, Matt, like maybe especially when you're great, like that's when the real haters come out, right? I mean, if you look at the New York Yankees, Duke basketball, the Lakers, like LeBron James is a great example of somebody who is undeniably great, arguably the greatest player in the history of basketball, one of the greatest athletes in sports. Yet people come up with all of these asterisks for his success, right? Like this championship didn't really count because Ray Allen bailed him out against the Spurs, and that's the only reason he won. Or he won his last championship because he was in the bubble, so it wasn't a real championship. And I think that there's some of that with Alabama too, right? But I think Nick Saban spoke to this not long ago or somebody did, where it was like it's all kind of evened out, right? Alabama has maybe won a couple that they shouldn't have won, and they've lost a couple that they should have won, right? So it's kind of balanced itself out, and Alabama has he's got 6 championships now. So again, how do you argue with greatness? But people will find a way, Matt. Life finds a way.
They do. All right, let's roll into our list here of the biggest villains of the Saban era, at least, Ben. And there's not too many that Alabama hasn't gotten more than their share of wins against. But we'll start at the bottom of your list and move to the top. So who's your first one?
So my first one is, again, about the perception, right? And it's not a person. It's more of a thing, a narrative, an idea. It's meaningless Sugar Bowl games that Alabama has lost. And I say meaningless, and there are a lot of people who don't agree with that, right? That bowl games are not meaningless. They're only meaningless if you lose the ones that you're supposed to win. And that's how Alabama fans cope with the fact that they lost to teams like Utah in 2008, teams like Oklahoma in 2013.
I'm gonna put the little quotes around it.
I think that's fair, but these losses really hit at the nerve, I think, of a lot of Alabama fans. I'm sure players and coaches too, who didn't want to lose those games. But if you look at it, if you look at it in the overall big picture of when these games were played, why they were played, Alabama fell short of making their way back into the national championship picture. Had they won the game before they played these bowl games, they would have been playing for a national championship. And so Alabama fans certainly think of these as letdown experiences for the teams, right? They didn't want to play in the Sugar Bowl that isn't for the national championship. They wanted to play for the national championship. They wanted to play in the college football playoff, and it didn't happen. So, of course, Alabama's team and their coaches are going to be less motivated to win a game against Utah. They'd rather be playing in the national championship against Oklahoma in 2008. They'd rather not have lost to Auburn in the kick six, and they'd rather be playing Missouri in the SEC championship and then ultimately Florida State in that national championship. So I think that the reason I've got this on the list is because Alabama fans see these losses as vulnerability for the rest of the country, where Alabama is on a big stage. They're in a big BCS bowl game in these cases, and they lose. They lose to these teams that Alabama and these SEC powerhouses are supposed to dominate. no matter what, you put any team in front of them, and they're supposed to dominate with all the trash that SEC fans talk. And again, this perception that Alabama is the elite of the elite, and then comes Utah, who is not supposed to beat Alabama. Alabama's supposed to dominate them, and then Utah basically dominates Alabama in pretty much every facet of the game. And so then Alabama fans think we suck, right? Like we suck, and everybody knows that we suck, and we're never going to get back on top because Utah has beaten us. And the same was true about Oklahoma. So those Sugar Bowl losses, as quote-unquote meaningless as they were, I think that those losses may sting as much, if not more, than some of the more meaningful losses.
I definitely, and it's funny because this is only a product of the BCS era, obviously, because the Sugar Bowl, the Sugar Bowl prior to the BCS was always a big deal every single year. And so it would have been a huge triumph to even get there. And so losing it would be a huge disappointment that you couldn't really couch any other way. But the BCS has sort of created this dynamic, and obviously it continued in the college football playoff until the Sugar Bowl became semifinal games, where the Sugar Bowl is kind of this it's most years when it's not part of the path to the national championship, it's this game that like nobody really you had a good season, but you probably feel like it should have been better for you to be there. And in some cases, there's another team there that you're playing against, and you mentioned Utah is a great example of it. I think we've seen other teams, not Alabama, other SEC teams make it to the Sugar Bowl and said, look, we got here because we won our mid-major conference, and we're thrilled to be here. We're thrilled to get on this huge stage. And you don't have the same level of enthusiasm on the other side. Tack on to that the players are spending a week in New Orleans, probably walking distance from Bourbon Street, and you've got a lot of reasons. You've got a recipe for a game with an asymmetrical dynamic to it, where one side is real thrilled to be there and really wants that win, and the other side, it doesn't mean as much to them. And I'm not saying that it wouldn't have meant anything for Alabama to win the Sugar Bowl against Utah. I'm not saying it wouldn't have meant anything for Alabama to beat Oklahoma. I think that one in particular probably stung a little bit more. But I think this is a situation where, again, if it's not for a national championship game, if it's not trying to redirect the national conversation about your team, it's really hard to get Alabama players in the Saban era excited for a bowl game. It's kind of a miracle that they did get up for those two Citrus Bowls, if you think about it.
Well, that I think is the inherent problem here, Matt, is that it's only meaningless, again, when you lose the game and everybody gets to make fun of Alabama, because when Alabama beats Michigan State in the Capital One Bowl in 2010 and beats their brains out, then suddenly the narrative is Alabama's just taking out their rough season on whoever their bowl opponent is, right? And then the same was true for Michigan in that Citrus Bowl that you mentioned, where it's just like Alabama, they fell short, but you just angered the sleeping giant, and they're just going to take it out on a Big Ten school. So it's like, okay, well, are you angry and taking it out on a team because you didn't make the national championship, or is it a letdown because you didn't make the national championship? It seems to depend on whether or not you win or lose, and what the narrative is around that. So it's a double-edged sword, to be sure, but I mean, those losses were very tough. They're still kind of tough to swallow, and those teams, Utah certainly will long have bragging rights. Alabama sort of righted the ship with the Orange Bowl a few years ago in the semifinal. With
arguably put Utah into the Pac-12. It arguably made Utah a Power 5 school.
Yeah, so it's a compliment to Alabama.
I mean, look, I think in retrospect, I don't think it stings as much as it probably used to. But
no, 6 national championships later, it shouldn't. Yeah, but I guarantee you, it still hurts a lot of fans who went to that game.
Oh yeah,
bought tickets to go to that Sugar Bowl to be humiliated by a non-Pac-12 team, a non Power 5 team. So
for sure. All right, let's go on to the next one, Ben. This is a a character that I think definitely is memorable, even though, again, I think like a lot of names on this list, most of them Alabama sort of had the last word on, at least currently. But let's get into your number 4.
Alabama usually has the last word, no matter what, Matt. There are very few instances where they don't. But my number 4 is Johnny Manziel, Johnny Football, the great Tennessee, they wish, Texas A&M quarterback, Heisman winner, who basically, you mentioned Utah made it into the Pac-12 based on their success against Alabama, maybe. It's very likely Johnny Manziel doesn't win the Heisman unless he has the game he has against Alabama and Tuscaloosa. The true coming out party for Johnny Football and the legend that was born that day. I was there in the stands as a fan, and it was just a sight to behold. I don't think anybody really understood what was happening, that this little guy was just running and throwing all over Alabama, who, in retrospect, again, we talk about surviving these little moments, right? These little moments of vulnerability, these things, these obstacles that are thrown in the path of these national championship winning teams. You could argue that the 2012 Alabama team is arguably the best team of the Saban era. Like, to me, that's like apex Saban era to some degree, like the way they went on to just absolutely dominate Notre Dame in the national championship. That's the same season Alabama was upset by Johnny Manziel. And it was an amazing game. Obviously, like, if you can kind of take yourself and your fandom out of it, you can see that it was just a performance for the ages. And he was a worthy Heisman winner, and he's one of the all-time great college football players, no matter what happened after his college career. But Johnny Manziel just became this thorn in the side of Alabama. I mean, he almost ruined the season for Alabama. It became win or go home after that loss that nobody expected. And Alabama had to do it again the next year in what was arguably an even better game. But we had an entire season to prepare for that 2013 game in Texas A&M, which I believe was very early in the season. And it was going to be this just massive showdown again, where Alabama gets their revenge on Johnny Football and is going to dominate them. I remember the Feinbaum callers leading up to that were amazing, just how it's just going to be this bloodbath where Alabama just tears them up. It was not the case. Johnny Manziel basically did whatever he wanted in that game. I think he threw for at least 300 yards, maybe even more than that. I'm looking at the stats now. He threw for 464 yards in that game against Alabama.
In a loss. Yeah.
Yeah, and Matt, there were 2 separate points in the game where Alabama was up by 21 points, where it's like, if you're up by 21 points, you should feel very comfortable. Nobody felt comfortable when Alabama was up by 21 points. They knew that Texas A&M could score on one play with these 90-something yard passes to Mike Evans from Johnny Manziel. I mean, this guy was just so dangerous. And I think that if there's one player that really made Saban sweat and gave him these like heart palpitations just as a coach, where it's just like, how do you stop this guy? I think it was Johnny Manziel. And you're right, though. Alabama survived, right? Like, they came out on top both of those seasons.
That's
so
true.
The first time they lose to Johnny Manziel, and they go on to win the national championship. He wins the Heisman. Good for you. Alabama would much rather have a national championship. The second time, Alabama won the game. And the season obviously didn't end how Alabama would hope, as we have covered many times here. But, I mean, I think when all was said and done, they broke even. But Alabama, I think, probably got the better end of the stick in that deal.
I think so. I mean, it was a big opportunity for Texas A&M, and I do think that it created, some amount of heat. And I think Texas A&M has been an interesting case in the SEC, because it's been tough to figure out what their thing is and what their place is in the SEC West and in the league as a whole. But I think that was kind of a time when that was a big moment for them to establish themselves as having some kind of relationship and some kind of dynamic with another school in their division. But yeah, you go back to that first game where Manziel it felt like, I mean, there had definitely been talk about him all season. He was putting up ridiculous numbers every week. He was the talk of social media. And then, he comes into that game. He rushes for nearly 100 yards. He's kind of doing it's the chaotic element of it, like you said. that I think that his mobility combined with what that mobility did, which was allow him to get the ball out so quickly to his receivers in a way that the defense couldn't anticipate. And I think that was really, in some ways, I mean, I think Saban had probably already been thinking about this, but in some ways, I'm going to credit Johnny Manziel for being the guy that made Saban realize, look, I got to do something different at quarterback now. I need to bring something else to the table. And I think that might sort of directly be what led to guys like Blake Sims and Jalen Hurts and Tua Tagovailoa becoming Alabama quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, he was a playmaker. Like, I mean, that's the thing. It's like when things went crazy, he somehow, stayed calm and made plays that to the detriment of Alabama. And I think that the reason I include him on this list when there are lots of quote unquote villains in the history of Alabama, I think if there's one player Alabama fans would never, ever want to play ever again, it would be Johnny Manziel. Same with Saban. I believe that to be true. And obviously they didn't have to, thankfully. But I think he is the player that was keeping fans and coaches up at night, just in terms of like mentally preparing for what was going to happen, because he was that good. He was that exciting and unpredictable, and he was very effective against Nick Saban's defenses.
All right, let's move to number 3 on your list, Ben.
Number 3 is the future of Alabama. It's Alabama's next head coach, which I think makes him a villainous figure in the eyes of a lot of fans. Clemson coach Dabo Swinney. Like, I say that sort of in jest, Matt. I'm sort of just kidding about this, but look, I think Dabo Swinney is the first phone call that they're going to make if and when Saban decides to bid farewell to this job, which will be a big job opening. And the fact that he's an alum, and the fact that he has 2 national championships, 2 championships where he beat Nick Saban. It's like, if you're going to pick the next coach, the next best coach, you want the coach that is good at beating Nick Saban, right? And as good as recruiting him, as good as him at recruiting, then Dabo Swinney fits that bill. Now, that being said, the non-football aspect of this, Matt, there are a lot of Alabama fans who are not big fans of Dabo. Let's introduce the term that a lot of fans use: never Dabo, right? Like, there are a lot of fans out there who use that hashtag and that saying. They don't want him here. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that he has had as much success as he has against Alabama. Again, beating them twice in national championship games, the last time beating Alabama's brains out. And a guy who seems to have Alabama figured out, or maybe it's Brett Venables, I don't know, but Dabo is leading that charge. And there are other reasons, certainly, too. I think Dabo's personality rubs people the wrong way for reasons perhaps others can explain. But, Dabo, I think, has become a fixture in terms of things people don't like at Alabama right now. But he's an Alabama native. He's a University of Alabama alum. He's a Alabama football player alum, and he's a very decorated head coach, Matt. So I think that this is something, a reality that people are they're going to have to potentially come to terms with in terms of the future of the program. I'm not saying it's going to happen. It may very well not. It will be a
discussion for sure.
Yeah, it may not, but you have to accept it as a potential reality.
I'll say this about Dabo, a couple of things. One, I think Alabama fans are always going to have bad feelings towards anybody who beats them multiple times, right? And that predates Saban. Alabama fans hate Steve Spurrier, less today, but he was the name that they used to spit when his name was spoken, and Phil Fulmer. And you can always find in your mind other reasons that you hate the guy other than he's better than me and he beat me multiple times. But it probably usually comes down to that. That's the root of it is, I guess a combination of jealousy and he's standing in our way. But I do think that Alabama fans are not the only people who don't like Dabo. And I think part of the reason why you've seen a little bit of that backlash after he was sort of this great underdog success story initially and getting out to, taking Clemson from this very low place to winning a national championship after losing one the year before to Alabama. So it's a great story on the front end. I think part of what made Saban what he is today, because there are plenty of college football coaches who have won a national title, maybe even two, and then it kind of fell off over time. Saban stayed on top, and it's an incredible feat. And I think part of what makes him special and unique is he knows how to handle success, which is a completely different job than building something up from the ground floor. It's obviously they're both difficult, but in some ways it's a different layer of difficulty to continue having success when that is the expectation. When everybody who's coming into your program expects success and expects to win, and maybe doesn't always think you have to work that hard for it because of entitlement, whatever you want to call it. It's a tough thing to do. I think that it's been curious to watch Dabo handle that level of success. They've obviously still been very successful. They're in the playoffs more often than they're not in the playoffs. They've completely dominated the ACC. But when you look at kind of the headlines that Nick Saban makes these days, it's typically him weighing in on matters that affect the entire sport, on issues that are affecting players, maybe how the game is changing over time. Dabo's headlines are a little bit more petty. They tend to be more focused on somebody did something bad to me. Somebody is slighting me. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that attitude that I think is sort of left over from being an underdog figure. And he hasn't quite transitioned into being the big dog yet. So but look, he's still a young guy. There's time to mature and age and whatever you want to call it. But I think that's a little bit where the backlash to Dabo comes from.
So, Matt, the way I would respond to that is there's only one Nick Saban.
For sure.
And the reality that people are going to have to accept if and when Nick Saban decides to retire in the next several years is they're going to have to accept a coach that is not Nick Saban and never will be. And that is the case with all of these college football programs who expect similar success to what Saban did and has continued to do at Alabama, and the consistency that he has had, that I think has cost a lot of good football coaches their jobs because they're not able to deliver what he is able to deliver. And the fact of the matter is that nobody is going to be able to do that because he is one of a kind, one of one, as people say, right? So to expect the same kind of temperament, the same kind of knowledge, and, whether you want to use the word character to some degree or maturity even, is probably unfair for whoever steps in, whether it's Dabo or somebody else. But there's no denying also that Dabo Swinney is a goofball. And he says goofy things, and he acts goofy during post-game interviews, and he gives sound bites that I think make people scratch their heads sometimes. But I think in the end, Matt, unless something, I'm not even going to speculate on what could happen between now and then, but, people forgive a lot for on-field football success, right? And if Dabo is a winner and is liked by enough of the fan base and has produced, in the way that he has, that is, look, nobody's going to win 6 championships at a school anytime soon the way Saban has, but Dabo has been as productive as you can be compared to Saban. So,
I want to highlight a comment actually on that note from one of our YouTube viewers, Paul. I'm sorry if I get your name wrong here. Paul Katsianis, I believe is how you would say this. He says, here's the take on Dabo. He's only done with Clemson what he's supposed to do. There is no reason for any large public Southern school not to be at the top of college football. They have the resources, prime location, college environment. There's no reason they shouldn't get the best of the best. If Dabo can do what he did at Clemson at a northern school, that'll show he's a good coach. So a couple of things on that note, Paul. I will say, first of all, nobody wants to go somewhere where it's harder to win. I mean, every coach wants to set himself up for, I would say you want to give yourself a program where you have the resources you need to have every advantage, and then you got to convert on it, because there's plenty of places in the South where, like you said, they have a lot of resources. They've got great environments. It's easy to recruit to them, and yet they don't have success. And I would point to Texas as one of those. I would say look at Florida State right now. That's a program that has a great history of winning, and it's been a long time since they've been successful down there. So it's not just about the resources. I think you have to execute, and you have to have everybody on the same page. And when you talk to people from Clemson, and I have, because Alabama's played Clemson so much, I've had an opportunity to be, in football stadiums with a lot of Clemson people over the last few years. They'll tell you that's really, Dabo's a big part of it, but the reason Clemson has done what they've done is similar to Alabama. Everybody at Clemson is on the same page. The donors, the administration, the people that work in the athletic department, they all kind of got on board and got on the same page. And that's what Alabama, that's what made Alabama what they are right now. Nick Saban, you have to have a great general that people trust to tell everybody what the right thing is to do. But you got to have everybody on board working towards the same goal. And you constantly hear that from Saban when he talks about Alabama. And I think that's a similar situation at Clemson. Now, they do have the advantage of being in a conference where many of the schools they play every year do not care about winning in college football. They do not try as hard as the rest of the SEC does. But as Chris points out here, Clemson was a joke before Dabo got there. They really were not. They were not a traditional powerhouse by any means. They were a very mid-level Power 5 program.
Clemsoning. He changed Clemsoning.
Right.
Dabo changed that. He changed that perception and that realities. But look, man, you're right. Good situations matter to coaches, right? Like, to use another NBA analogy, like look at Steve Kerr. His choice before he became a head coach was you can either coach the Knicks, which are the Knicks, or you can coach the Golden State Warriors that have Steph Curry and Klay Thompson and all these great players and are poised to just take the next step to become champions. Who did he choose, Matt? Right? So good situations matter. Like, you don't necessarily want to walk into like a very difficult, challenging situation. And that's going to be the case. If Dabo transitions to Alabama, it will be tough. Alabama will have all the resources available to have him be successful. But at the same time, he's going to go from a very, in what Alabama fans would call a very cushy situation, right? Where it's easier to win at Clemson. It's easier to make it to the playoff. The SEC is way more grueling than the ACC, et cetera. Why would he want to leave that situation and come to Alabama to follow Saban, to always coach in that shadow? My thing is, I think coaches also care about legacy too. And why would he want to be perceived as a guy who wants to take the easy path, right, to success? Maybe he does want to challenge himself. Maybe he's always wanted to be the Alabama head coach, and now he's going to be in a position to do that. So we'll see what happens. Again, I'm not saying I predict Dabo Swinney will be the next head coach at Alabama. I just think that it's a very likely possibility, and he will be one of, if not the first phone call when that situation comes.
Judging by the volume of comments that have suddenly been flooding in, I think people have big opinions on this. But let's move on to number 2 on your list, Ben.
Another coach who will never be the Alabama head coach and just took an NFL job for that matter. And I should never say never, but Urban Meyer Urban Meyer is my number 2, a guy that I just don't think Alabama fans like very much. I don't mean to speak for the entire fan base, but I just think he's a guy who is pretty widely accepted as a villain, and I think he's a guy who embraces that role to a degree. A brilliant football mind and somebody who is very successful, a multiple national championship winner. But at the same time, he's a guy who, like Dabo Swinney, has prevented Alabama from winning national championships on 2 separate occasions. We're talking about the 2008 SEC championship, where it seemed like whoever won that game was going to go on to win the national championship. No offense to Oklahoma. And that's what happened, obviously, with Tim Tebow and Urban Meyer's team beating Alabama, who wasn't quite ready yet for that stage. And then, obviously, in 2014, when Urban Meyer's Ohio State team beat Alabama in the semifinal game in convincing fashion, similar to the Utah game and the Oklahoma game that we mentioned before. Also in the Sugar Bowl, not a fun place all the time for Alabama in recent years. But Urban Meyer is just a guy who was kind of like, in some ways, kryptonite to Alabama, just in terms of having his programs in a better position at awkward times for Nick Saban's programs, whether they were emerging, whether they were in transition, I guess, which was kind of the case in 2014, where you did have Blake Sims, who was very good at quarterback, and we've talked about him and being big fans of Blake Sims, but that was Lane Kiffin's first season as offensive coordinator, and Alabama was sort of transitioning into becoming a more high-powered offense as opposed to a very run-heavy defense-first type team. And there was Urban Meyer to sort of take advantage of that timing for Ohio State and Florida. And again, just a guy who recruited so well and is obviously a very good coach and ran an offense that was sort of a kryptonite type offense when it came to what Alabama was able to stop. Alabama was able to obviously overcome that during his Florida tenure, beating Florida in 2009 and basically dominating the rest of Urban Meyer's tenure as the Florida head coach, and maybe, just in some people's eyes, running him out of the job in some respects. So yeah, Urban Meyer is up on this list, and he's higher than Dabo for me because I just think, and this isn't necessarily the case for me, but I just still think that Alabama fans are just not big Urban Meyer fans.
For sure. I mean, I think that he's developed this sort of deeply, I mean, look, at least I agree with your ranking here of putting him ahead of Dabo on the villains list, because I think that there are at least divided opinions on Dabo. There are people who like Dabo in the Alabama fan base. I cannot imagine there's anybody in the Bama fan base that says, I kind of like Urban Meyer. Like, I just think he's got all of the sort of grouchiness and dourness that people often talk about Saban having, but he does not have that lasting positive impression that he's built at the schools he's been to, other than potentially Utah, I guess, because the legacy of them elevating their program to another level after Urban Meyer. But you look at Florida, I mean, he left Florida in shambles, and that program in many ways still has not recovered from the sort of disarray that started to occur under Urban Meyer. You look at Ohio State, and obviously they made it to the national championship game this season, but Ohio State also had a lot of fallout after Urban Meyer left. There were a lot of scandals that were left over. I think he tends to leave a bad taste in people's mouth wherever he's been. There's no question, like you said, in terms of his strength as a coach, he will always be looked back at, I think, as contemporary to Saban. When people talk about the greatest coaches of the 21st century in college football, Urban Meyer is going to be in that conversation. I think it'll be pretty tough for anybody to pull ahead of Nick Saban in that discussion, but Urban Meyer's right there. And for many years, until very recently, until probably about 2017, I think most people would have said it's a toss-up between Urban Meyer and Nick Saban.
Yeah, and he's a 3-time national championship winner, and he beat Alabama when it mattered most, right? Like, I joke about the meaningful bowl games, but he beat Alabama in the SEC championship. Winner goes to the national championship. He beat Alabama in the college football semifinal, the first one ever. Ohio State, vanquishes the mighty SEC demon that is Alabama and has bragging rights until at least this past national championship. So, again, stinging losses for Alabama fans because the stakes were so high. These were games that really mattered, and Urban Meyer was the one pulling the strings, so to speak. He was the puppet master of those teams and orchestrated very good programs. But like you said, it's interesting to see where he left those programs when he left them. So, but it's not a problem that Alabama is going to have to deal with anytime soon.
Godspeed to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Good luck to you guys. So Ben, our number one villain, and I've got a couple of honorable mentions that I want to get to after that, but let's get to the number one villain for Bama fans.
It's Cam Newton. It's got to be, right? Like
1-0 versus Alabama.
Woo, man, that was a tough one. We've talked about difficult losses. That one was up there certainly for me as a fan, even more so than the kick six. And I think in large part because Cam Newton is that villain, right? Like he dresses like a Batman villain now. Like everybody jokes about it. Like he embraces the villain role.
Yeah.
I mean, look, Cam certainly knows more about fashion than I do. That's a joke. But look, he was somebody who I think did embrace. He was a hero in the eyes of so many people in college football. Obviously, Auburn, arguably the greatest player ever at Auburn. I mean, no offense to Bo Jackson or some of those great players, but
I shouldn't be saying this on this show, but a lot of people would say the best individual season for a player ever in college football. And I mean, I think there are probably in the last couple of years, the last two Heisman winners maybe have made it a more interesting conversation, but until then, it wasn't really even a debate.
Well, there was very much like, I don't know quite how to put this, Matt, but there was very much like a stop the steal attitude when it came to the 2010 season, just from Alabama fans in terms of that game doesn't count. This whole season's not going to count. Their national championship won't count, all this stuff and all this. You know what I mean? Like, it's over, guys. They won. They beat Alabama. They won the SEC. He won the Heisman. They won the national championship. He was just that great. He was just as good as advertised, as good as his reputation that preceded him. There was a lot of speculation. How good is this guy going to be at Auburn? And I think Alabama fans were kind of shaking in their boots about Cam Newton and how good he was going to be. I don't think anybody expected that he would be the Heisman winner, that Auburn would go undefeated, that Auburn would win a national championship, but it all happened. And you're right. He has an argument for best college football player of all time based on one season. He has an argument. He may be the best. He may be. But that Iron Bowl, again, like you go back to the stakes of that Iron Bowl. The national championship was not on the line against it was not on the line in that game. Alabama was out of the picture. But I think Alabama fans sort of relished in the idea of stopping Cam Newton and stopping Auburn and throwing a wrench into their national championship hopes and their momentum, beating them the way that they were in the first half when they were up 24-0. Alabama fans were relishing that. They had Cam Newton right where they wanted him. He was like he was who they thought they were, so to speak, right? Like he was all hype, and Alabama was going to be the team that finally brought mighty Cam Newton down. Didn't happen. He and the rest of the Auburn team obviously had put forth a heroic effort in the second half, came back and won that game in historic fashion at this point. But yeah, I just think that it's one of those things where it's like Alabama fans can't stand the sight, the sound, the mention of something. And Cam Newton he checks every single box when it comes to somebody who was just so good at thwarting Alabama and Alabama fans' hopes. So it's Auburn. Like, again, like it would have to be an Auburn player or an Auburn coach, their arch rival, right? So if Alabama's Superman, then I guess he's Lex Luthor and all the villains combined, the rogues gallery, throw it all in there. That's Cam Newton.
Yeah, I'm not posting this comment as an endorsement of what Matt Lunsford, our commenter, is saying, but I just want to show it because I think it's a good representative of how a lot of Alabama fans feel about him. He says Auburn got caught paying him and still got away with it. I think that's what we hate the most. Alabama would have gotten the death penalty. So that's, again, I'm not saying I think that's what happened. The NCAA has exonerated Auburn over what happened, but I think that's the attitude of the Alabama fan base. So the narrative, looking back at it, is that it was so obvious to Bama fans and to many other fans around the country that they felt Auburn was cheating that year.
Right.
And then to watch them win the championship, I think that's what made it really extra hard to swallow for a lot of people. But part of the deal in college football, once you've been on that stage and you're getting the trophy handed to you and they're dropping the confetti, it really doesn't matter what happens after that. I mean, they even if something had happened with the NCAA, I don't think you can really take those moments away. And that's what you're trying to win in college football. You just want that moment where you get declared the champion.
Right. They won the game. When they blew the whistle, they won the game. And do you want to really go back and say, nah, on a technicality?
Right.
You know, like, no, you don't want to do that. It's over, and it's okay to have villains in your stories, right? Like you need villains. This time it was the Empire Strikes Back, even though, in the eyes of most people, Alabama is certainly the Empire. But it was tough. It was tough. And again, I think most Alabama fans too can acknowledge his greatness and like how great he truly was that season, and how just incredible of a run that really was. And obviously that translated to a degree in the NFL, where he became MVP, nearly won a Super Bowl.
But as NWAT pointed out earlier, Bama fans were all in for Peyton Manning all of a sudden because that's how bad they hated Cam Newton. That's how much they wanted him to lose. And I'm getting a couple of these comments too. Can't wait to see Matt take his job. There's like a chance for Bama fans to have another chapter written onto the end of the Cam Newton story where somehow Alabama gets this win over him.
Well, that's the thing. It's like it'll never take away what happened.
No,
it'll just see this. Tyler Elliott says we'll avenge the 2010 Iron Bowl by taking his job. I mean, okay. I mean, look, Alabama has plenty to be happy about. And in the grand scheme of things, again, it didn't cost them the national championship, and surrounding that, and since then they've won 6. So Alabama, but you hear coaches say it all the time, Matt. Like, the wins are great, but you really remember the losses, right? And that's true for Alabama.
Especially when they're rare.
Exactly, when they're this rare. I mean, when I saw somebody share like Nick Saban's wins and losses record recently, and it was like 166-23, and I just thought, like, man, 23, that sounds like a lot, like even for his era over over 14 years.
I bet if you gave us a few minutes, we could probably name every single one of them.
Easy. Yeah, exactly. In vivid detail, too. Like, vivid detail. Every fan watching this and commenting, every Alabama fan who isn't watching and commenting, they could do the exact same thing. Believe me. And I think this loss, Cam Newton's season, is probably at the top of the list for a lot of people out there. Again, I think the fact that he was the Auburn quarterback, and the fact that he led Auburn to a national championship before Alabama's very eyes, and that Alabama was one of the stepping stones that just got stomped on the head on their way to that national championship season, is just what hurts so bad. So Cam Newton, he's got to be number one. I make an argument for another number one.
I can't disagree at all. I do have a couple of honorable mentions I want to throw out there, and you said it would have to be somebody from Auburn at the number one spot. And I think pre-Saban era, you can make an argument that the number one Bama villain is probably from Auburn too. And I would say maybe it's Pat Dye, just in terms of what a thorn in the side he was to Alabama. But in the Saban era, I got to give an honorable mention to another Auburn-related figure, and that's Gus Malzahn, who is now not at Auburn anymore. He's now at UCF. Another sort of thorn in the side of Alabama in a smaller way. But even though Nick Saban certainly won more than he lost against Gus Malzahn, and Gus's last game was an Iron Bowl loss, so I don't think Alabama fans sort of walk away from this era having this same level of heat against Gus. But there have absolutely been periods of Gus Malzahn's tenure at Auburn where he had a lot of heat with Bama fans, and he was definitely viewed as a big time villain that fans had real strong feelings about, I think.
Yeah, I personally, I'm not an Auburn fan, and I know that a lot of Auburn fans were kind of fed up with the Malzahn era. But on the outside, I kind of was like, why are you firing Gus Malzahn? This guy, other than Dabo Swinney and Hugh Freeze, who I think can maybe be an honorable mention here too. This guy's the best at beating Nick Saban. Like, to me, just based on watching him, he did it, 3 or 4 times? I guess if you want to count the Cam Newton game, but
we'll say he was a part of it. We'll give him 3.5.
Certainly. A lot of people give him credit for that season, let alone that game. But he was the best at beating Nick Saban. He played him every year. He obviously gave him a lot of trouble. And whenever Auburn was good, whenever they were competitive, ranked in the top 10, whenever they were kind of like hanging around and in the picture, Nick Saban really struggled against those Gus Malzahn Auburn teams. So he deserves a lot of credit. Again, another thorn in the sides. I think that, another honorable mention for me, Matt, and sorry if I'm stepping on one of yours, spread offenses, right? Like
for sure,
Mickey Mouse offenses, right? that Gus Malzahn helped innovate and beat Alabama with. The way I cope with the kick six is to say that it was a freak accident. Like I didn't feel it as much because it was like ripping off a Band-Aid as opposed to like the slow death of the Cam Newton game. But that being said, even if it took this freak play to beat Alabama, to put them in the position to do that, Gus Malzahn's offense, led by Nick Marshall and Trey Mason that year, they were giving Alabama a lot of trouble, and it was because of the way it was designed and the way it just clawed and irked Saban's defenses. So yeah, Gus Malzahn's a good pick.
I'm gonna call Hugh Freeze the volcano to Gus Malzahn's Dante's Peak, if you will. Very, very similar ideas, just maybe a little bit less well known. But I've got one more that I want to throw up here. And if this, I'm not the wrestling fan that you are, Ben, but if we were talking about this in wrestling terms, I think this would be the guy on the NXT circuit right now, in terms of Bama villains, the up and coming Bama villain. I'm going with Lane Kiffin. So he doesn't have a win over Alabama yet, but his 2 times that he has directly faced Alabama, he gave them absolute hell. And I think he's at least at a stage right now where maybe Bama fans don't hate Lane Kiffin yet, but they're definitely going to be sweating the next time they play him, and they're not looking forward to it. And I think there's a lot of reason to worry that he could be the next big villain on the list here.
He's got a lot to prove as a head coach, though. He's had a lot of opportunities, and it hasn't quite clicked, I think, the way that he certainly has hoped, and fans in Tennessee and USC and Oakland and now Ole Miss for that matter. But look, if he makes Alabama fans sweat more than they did last time they played Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss team, then it's going to be a big problem. So, yeah, I mean, there's good reason to expect big things from Lane Kiffin. On the other side of that coin, if we want to stick with the wrestling references, you got to throw Kirby Smart in as one of the villains of the Saban era, especially when it comes to recruiting, right?
For sure, Ben. And I would ask you this, though. Look, again, as a person who understands the dynamics of fight storytelling like you do, and we'll address Matt Lunsford's question in a second before we wrap up. But Kirby's a villain, right, to Alabama, but he loses every time. So does that make him a jobber?
Well, he's given Alabama some scares. We'll say that. But what I would say, the way I would kind of compare it is, there's a famous split of a famous tag team, the Rockers, between Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty. When Shawn Michaels super kicked Marty Jannetty through the barbershop window and went on to become the superstar that he was. I feel like Kirby tried to be Shawn Michaels and tried to kick Alabama in the face, but he was really Marty Jannetty all along, right? He was not going to become Shawn Michaels. So he tried to be Shawn Michaels. He's tried to split up the Rockers, but in the end, he was just a Marty Jannetty. So
since I've never heard of Marty Jannetty, I think I get the point of your story there. I think I get it. So Matt does ask. He's talking about Lane Kiffin. Could he come back after Saban retires? We talked about Dabo earlier. Let's throw this one out at the end of the show. Do we think that there's a decent chance that Lane Kiffin ends up as the Alabama head coach, Ben?
No. I don't know why, my first thought is to say no. I mean, it obviously depends on how well he does at Ole Miss, but look, he has wandered himself into some really good jobs for doing a lot less. You know what I mean? But Lane Kiffin is inarguably one of the great minds, offensive minds in college football history at this point. So, and I think Alabama fans, for the most part, view him pretty favorably in terms of the job he did as offensive coordinator. But he certainly has his quirks and his personality traits that I think are going to be hit or miss. I think like the college crowd probably loves it and would embrace it, but you got to wonder about some Alabama fans who just like aren't as into Lane Kiffin as others are. I'll just say. So I don't know. I mean, look, if anybody is winning national championships or is on the cusp of doing so, recruiting really well, beating Alabama, then they're going to be a candidate to be the next coach at Alabama. And he certainly has a history of doing very well, winning 3 straight SEC championships, 1 national championship, getting to another national championship. So his track record speaks for itself. Like, he's obviously a great coach. Whether he's going to be a great head coach still remains to be seen. So let's just see how he does.
I agree. I think you got it. We talked about Dabo earlier, having that thing with Saban where he works well with the people inside the program with him. He works well with coaches and administrators and boosters and donors and all of that machinery you have to deal with. I think that's the part of it that Lane Kiffin has to show that he can handle well before he's taken seriously as a head coaching candidate at a big time program like Alabama. Great discussion today from everybody in the comments on YouTube and Facebook. Really, really great contributions. I'll throw one more out here. Rob Robertson, who basically says here that Jordan Hare should be considered one of the big rivals to Alabama, which is a great argument, Rob. I think even if we're talking about Auburn figures like Pat Dye and Gus Malzahn, it's Jordan Hare that seems to be really where Alabama faces their big peril. So that deserves an honorable mention in and of itself. An inanimate object making an entry to the list at the last minute.
I like the Van Halen avatar on Rob just then, but I'd also throw out there, we already mentioned the media, Matt, the media and all the rat poison, one of the biggest villains in Alabama history, and also College Game Day for that matter. Whenever College Game Day would come to Tuscaloosa, it would seem like Alabama would lose, but I think Alabama has probably alleviated that curse. They've done pretty well since they have become this mainstream juggernaut. So don't have to really sweat College Game Day coming to town anymore. Or Lee Corso picking Alabama. Everybody would say, if Lee Corso picks Alabama, they're going to lose. I don't think that's right. Nothing Alabama fans have to worry about anymore.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks again to everybody who contributed today. Really good discussion as always here on Bammers. We do this every Thursday morning, right where you're watching it. Whether it's on Facebook or YouTube. So join us again next Thursday. We're going to keep this going all year long. So, Ben, thanks as always, man. And thanks to everybody for watching and contributing.